You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Supply chains are almost back to normal in terms of activity, inventories, and seasonality. Yet there are plenty of uncertainties in both government policy and physical risk heading into the second half of 2023. And that's what we'll be exploring today. I'm Kristen Hallam, content strategist at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and your host for this episode of the Economics and Country Risk podcast. You'll hear about the outlook for supply chains from Chris Rogers, head of supply chain research at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
Thanks very much, Kristen.
So, Chris, what is the biggest piece of evidence you have seen that supply chain activity is returning to normal?
The one kind of data point that was pretty obvious at the depths of all the problems with supply chains was supplier delivery times. Whether you were a large corporation awaiting the arrival of a container ship with hundreds of containers on, or just people like you and me who were waiting for their delivery of whatever it was you needed to work from home from Amazon. The delays that everybody saw were really a foundational part of the experience during the supply chain crisis of the past couple of years. And so the way we've tracked that and looked at that is using the S&P Global PMIs, the Purchasing Manager Index for supplier delivery times. Now, it's a slightly abstract measure, but the important point that comes out of it is that supplier delivery times at the end of 2021 were pretty much the worst they'd ever been on record in late 2021. And as of May of this year, which is the second to last data point that we've had, they were the fastest that they'd been since April of 2009. So that swing that we've seen over an 18-month period has been the single biggest piece of evidence that supply chains are, if not back to normal, or at least returning to normal.
And what are some other signs that you're seeing that things are normalizing, Chris?
We track a lot of different data points, but if I was going to pull out two, and again, these are ones where there were maybe issues in the past that are now returning to normal. One is looking at corporate inventories. One of the ways to look at that is using the PMI, so the survey data on stocks of finished goods and stocks of purchases. Those are pretty much back to a situation of balance, having been effectively showing significant shortages in the middle of 2021 through the middle of 2022. And then we swung to having an excess of stocks in the fourth quarter of last year. And then the other way to look at that data is through the management data that we get from corporate financial information on S&P Global Capital IQ. We have the financial data for most large companies in the world. And if we look at the inventory to sales ratio, on average across most companies, we've returned from there being a shortage in 2021 to being a surplus at the beginning of last year. And now we've kind of returned back to normal. Not everywhere, but in most places. Aside from inventories, the other big area of normalization we've seen is in the seasonality of shipping. So we don't buy things on an even basis throughout the year. There's always a spike in spending, particularly in consumer goods, in the fourth quarter of each year. So this concept of the peak shipping season, without going through every year over the past 5 years, what we really saw during 2021 was that there wasn't a peak season because it was just full on all the time. In 2022, what we saw was a lot of shipping was brought in much earlier than normal because companies wanted to avoid shortfalls. So far this year, in terms of tracking the seasonality of shipments, we seem to have had something of a return to normal. So I would say the inventory data and the seasonality data are showing a sign of normalization as well.
All right. So quite a bit of evidence there. Now, we mentioned that things were almost back to normal. What is not yet normal in terms of supply chains?
The first thing is, without getting too philosophical about it, what is normal? Right? Yeah. Are we seeing a return? Are we seeing a return to historic patterns of trade, historic levels of trade, historic activity in terms of warehousing, in terms of sourcing? I think the important point is that we've had three major shocks over the past few years: the US-China trade war, the pandemic, and the war in Ukraine, that have really been major events that have affected a lot of supply chains. But on a day-to-day basis, supply chains face all kinds of volatility, whether that's caused by boats stuck in a canal or a strike in a port or whatever. So I would say almost back to normal. It's more a case of almost back to a degree of business as usual, everything else being equal. But what I would say is there's probably two areas where we've not yet seen signs of normality. First, to come back to that point about inventories, not all sectors' inventories have really returned to normal yet. We've certainly seen in the personal computing space and also in building supplies that inventories are way higher than they ever have been historically. So they're not quite back to normal yet. The other area that's not back to normal is the electronics industry and the sourcing of electronic components. We still have a situation where there's a surplus in some parts of that space. If you look at memory chips, for example, there's an oversupply of those at the moment. But if you look at power controllers and high-end processors, there's still a shortage of those. So the electronic space is still very much kind of off balance.
Got it. So maybe it's a good time for me to buy a PC if there is a surplus, maybe get some deals. What do you think?
I think heading into the holiday season, it's not a bad idea to see if there's some bargains out there.
All right. And for those sectors that you mentioned, Chris, do you see things normalizing this year, or do you think it will take longer to get back to that business as usual?
So it's difficult to put a precise time frame on it, which is a very analyst thing to say. A lot of the issues supply chains have faced have not been supply related, they've been demand related, right? So all of that congestion in ports is because we're all buying lots of large bulky products like furniture, for example. And as soon as that demand goes away, so the supply chains or certainly the logistics networks have unbunged. So for those businesses that have not yet returned to normal, it is partly a demand thing. So if you're thinking about electronics, it's a case of, okay, when will demand improve again for some of those electronic goods? And certainly we've written research that looks through what a lot of companies have been saying in terms of when they expect to return to normal. The state of the art there is probably in the fourth quarter of this year, we'll start to see demand return. And that will start to eat up some of those surplus inventories and some of that excess of component supply that's out there as well. If we're thinking about normalization of seasonality and the seasonal patterns, we won't really know whether we're there until we get through peak season. So that's later in the year, particularly for consumer goods. As a result, the proof of the normality pudding, as it were, is probably not until the fourth quarter at the earliest, and in many places will be sometime next year. But again, as I've already said, there's always something going on in supply chains. There's always some sort of upheaval, whether there's physical risks or political risks. There's always something that needs to be managed.
And that's what makes it so fun to discuss it with you, Chris.
Why, thank you. It certainly gives me plenty to write about.
Now, you mentioned your research there, and I did want to ask you about your report on the third quarter supply chain outlook. In that report, you mentioned physical risks to watch. What exactly should we be watching for there?
There's probably two major clusters of physical risk that supply chains face time and again. First is the impact of the state of the environment. Rainfall and storms are a specific issue that international supply chains face. So far, we haven't, and touch wood, we won't see significant hurricane season in the Atlantic basin. We've already had some pretty bad storms in the Pacific basin this year, but certainly to be watching out for the latter part of the hurricane season, which overlaps with the peak shipping season. But specifically in terms of environmental issues at the moment, it's all around rainfall in Central America. So the Panama Canal, which is a major conduit of trade from Asia to the US East Coast and into Europe, has had to limit the draft of vessels, so how full the big vessels can be, and therefore how much water do they need underneath them to float, and also the number of vessels that go through that canal. So there's a restriction there in the Panama Canal. It's not like the Suez Canal, which actually closed for several days. It's not as extreme as that, but it's more of an irritation to trade, and it's already leading companies to rethink the structure of their supply chains going into peak season. Related to that, the other big area of physical risk is around the human element. So are we seeing strike action going on? Now, there's a number of strikes that are already ongoing or are threatened. So we've got port strikes going on in Canada at the moment. We've got the very real risk of a parcel workers strike in the United States. We've got some air freight issues going on in Germany. And it's also not just about logistics. The contract that the big automakers have with the United Auto Workers Union, that contract comes up during the latter part of this year. So I'd say I'd be keeping a close eye on the strike action. On that West Coast thing as well, by the way, whilst there has been a deal reached between the unions and the port operators on the US West Coast, that's yet to be fully ratified. So watch the weather, watch the strikes. Those are the main physical risks that are out there.
Never a dull moment, as we said.
Absolutely.
So in your report, you also mentioned policy risks, including a review of US duties on imports from mainland China. What should businesses be watching for on that front?
Without getting into all the kind of tariff nerdery, which we could probably spend a whole podcast on tariff issues and probably no one will listen to it. But there's a specific review of the tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration against imports from China under this Section 301 classification. So this was, to paraphrase, the trade war. Those are under review at the moment, and a review result is due later this year. So if anything, that's a positive risk, right? Because there's the potential that those tariffs, which on a lot of goods that are applied to the tariff rate's about 25%, we've seen some quite significant shifts in supply chain in response to that. That review is worth watching. Now, will it actually lead to any changes? That's a completely different matter. And I think it's worth keeping an eye on the geopolitical situation between the US and China during the early fourth quarter. It'll be worth keeping an eye on the US Trade Representative and the US ITC websites to see if we get any news on those tariffs.
Good advice. Will do. Now, another policy risk you mentioned in your report relates to EU-focused environmental regulations that may come into force this year. Which industries are facing the brunt of those regulations?
So I guess the bad news is that there's lots of different regulations coming through.
Regulations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the EU has been something of a leader in environmental regulation for a number of years. What the EU are doing this time around, I think there's 3 areas of regulations to keep an eye on. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Corporate Sustainability Directive, and a potential Green Steel deal between the US and the EU. Now, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is effectively a tax on imports of certain products based on the carbon emissions of the country where those products are sourced from. The main products I'm interested in there are steel and aluminium. If we look at the other products that are covered by that regulation, CBAM, it's much more things like building materials, electricity and so on that are more locally traded. So many products use steel and aluminium that we are, I think, going to see a lot of different industries affected by that. Clearly, the Green Steel deal, bit of rhyme for you, the Green Steel deal is still under negotiation with the US, and that will, I think, have some overlap with CBAM. Just from a timing perspective, from October of this year, you have to start reporting your emissions under CBAM, but actually making payments, so making those tariff payments, is a couple of years down the road as of yet. I think the other one that's going to be a real challenge for a lot of companies on a very broad basis is the Corporate Sustainability Directive. Now, that's passed the European Parliament and hasn't yet been passed by the individual countries, so there's a few more stages to go there. But the directive requires companies to very broadly monitor and assess the impact of their value chain partners on a range of environmental and human rights measures. So even if the direct kind of dollars and cents or euros and cents impact of these regulations doesn't kick in this year, then certainly the companies involved, those industries, are going to have to start gathering their data and making their plans. To answer your question directly, it's the metals industries, and particularly steel and aluminium, that are affected by those.
Lots to navigate there. Maybe this is a good time to plug the monthly newsletter that you produce. Good way to stay on top of all these changes and the impact.
Well, hopefully so. Yeah, so we put together Supply Chain Essentials. This is basically designed to pull together the latest insights. We actually publish a weekly report for our customers, and we take some of the juicy elements out of that and we send those around on a monthly basis.
So, Chris, I'm going to pose the same question that I did when we had you on the podcast to talk about the second quarter outlook. which is related to corporate inventory strategies. Companies are implementing changes to their supply chains in light of all the shocks the past 3+ years that you've mentioned throughout the podcast today. Which kinds of companies, or in other words, what sectors are pursuing these changes?
Yes, is Kristen's supply chain interrogation. Keep asking the same questions every quarter and look for the inconsistencies. No, I think it's a good point, right? Because at the beginning of the year, it was a case of, all right, we've had plenty of evidence over the past couple of years that existing supply chain inventory strategies didn't work when they needed to work. And so will the adaptations that are required to respond to that actually going to be put in place or not? At the beginning of the year, we were hopeful that companies would start talking about those changes, maybe even make those changes by moving from just in case to just in time type inventory strategies. At this stage, it's actually not clear that anyone is going to go to a just in case approach. Now, clearly, not anyone is an exaggeration, but we've yet to see evidence of companies saying, actually, we need to shift our inventory strategy decisively towards a more conservative approach. As I mentioned earlier, when we look at that inventory to sales ratio, there are some sectors who still have an inventory to sales ratio that's much higher than it was in the past. Building supplies and computing were the two examples that I noted in the report, but there are others. And the question there is that the companies being more conservative and saying, actually, we were running a little bit too lean, we need to carry more inventories? Actually, when you look at what the companies are saying within their earnings calls, and we're about to get a new round of earnings calls over the second part of July and into August, but in the most recent set of calls, companies are basically saying, actually, our inventories are high because we expect sales to recover. In other words, this is a temporary situation. It will work itself out later in the year as demand improves. Now, the question there is it a case that actually it was all a fever dream the past 2 years, you don't have to worry about it, actually, just in case or a change in inventory strategies aren't needed? I think it's more sophisticated than that. The issue is that at the moment, interest rates are high and in some areas rising. And so the opportunity cost of keeping higher inventories is much higher than it was a year or 2 years ago. If you're a supply chain manager at the moment, you go to your corporate finance officer and say, hey, I want to increase my inventories. Well, what's required of that? Well, we need to basically have $5 to $10 million worth of extra stock on our shelves. That, of course, now has a significant carry cost that it didn't have in the past when interest rates are in the order of 5% rather than being in the order of no percent as they were in the past. So once we get to this situation where maybe the demand situation has balanced out, maybe as interest rates start to come down, then we'll get a better sign of whether companies are genuinely going to invest in resilience through their inventories or whether they're just going to wait for the next disaster to arrive.
That maybe doesn't seem like the best course of action, is just to wait and see in this kind of environment. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's probably not the best route to go down in any kind of environment. As I mentioned earlier, there's so many individual supply chain shocks that can happen either to individual countries or individual companies or individual trade lanes, that the strategy has to be done on a very intentful basis and taking into account all of the risks. And frankly put, the risk calculations at 5% interest rates are very different to what they are at a low interest rate environment, because you may say, well, my supply chain's fine, but I've made my balance sheet weaker. So which part of that do you want to follow? And I think it's also important to note that inventory strategies are just one of a very wide range of different changes that companies could implement.
That's a good point. One strategy I wanted to ask you about, which I think we also talked about last time, I don't know if there's been any movement on the reshoring, nearshoring, I think X-shoring is what you called it.
Yes.
Insert type of shoring here.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, so I think, as I maybe mentioned last time, companies are always going through this process of continually reviewing, are they buying their products at the best price, at the lowest risk, or some balance thereof. So from quarter to quarter, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a significant change. I think in the same way that changing your inventory strategy is expensive, so it is shifting your sourcing. There's a lot of discussion about de-risking, effectively some form of bifurcation in some strategies between your markets in the US and Europe versus your markets in mainland China or elsewhere in Asia. And so that process of review is really ongoing. I think what we may start to see in the second half of this year is companies start to make announcements again about those longer term choices, because frankly put, there is so much news around the technology rivalry between mainland China and the US/EU and others. I think it's worth bearing in mind, and we show this in the research report, that we've already seen a significant amount of reshoring for lots of different reasons. And that's not just being driven by the latest risks. It's been driven by the tariffs that we talked about earlier. It's been driven by the ongoing quest to find lower labor costs. Even if there were no geopolitics out there, companies would still be reshoring. But again, reshoring takes quite a long time and it's expensive. If you're a manufacturer, you've got to find a new site, you've got to build it. If you are a buyer, you've got to qualify, and your suppliers, you've got to ensure that the quality is there, particularly for any product that's seasonal where you have kind of peaking demand that you've got to take account of. And then layered on top of that, companies have got to ask themselves, it's not just about reshoring. There's a little bit of, hey, let's create a new one, who-shoring. Am I sourcing from a country that doesn't appear to be high risk, but the company is high risk that I'm working with? So mapping that more fully. And at the same time, companies have got to ask themselves, do I want more than one supplier from a given country? There's a lot of different inputs to that. All of them cost money. And as I say, all of them come at a time when money is tight for a lot of companies.
I love that you added a new shoring to our list, the who-shoring. So I'll be sure to know that.
Yeah, it's a bit Dr. Seuss, that, isn't it? Who-shoring.
Indeed. So let's talk signposts. Are there one or two data points that you're watching closely this quarter?
There's probably a whole cluster of them. I've just published a report that is the 10 different numbers that defined what happened in the first half of the year for supply chains. I won't go through all 10 of those now, but I would say things that are worth tracking: trade volumes. They're a good sign of what's going on in the real economy. Clearly, it's very easy to look at the international macro trade data, but you've always got to adjust for inflation. So looking at the volume of trade, I think, is an important sign of what corporate participants in supply chains think is going on. Our global trade forecast is for a very slow recovery from later in the year. And even next year in 2024, growth will be relatively slow. So we'll be looking for confirmation of that. I mentioned already the PMIs for inventories. I'd also be watching the PMI for new orders. At the moment, for global manufacturing, that's very weak. Clearly, there's a difference by industry, and we do have different industries within that data set. But given that so many of the past issues have been driven by demand and so much of the recovery has been driven by demand, keeping an eye on those new orders, I think, is quite important. I'd also, as I mentioned earlier, we're just entering the corporate earnings reporting season. So latest data on things like inventory turns, as well as what the companies are saying within their earnings calls, is important to track.
So we've covered a lot of ground, but is there one particular takeaway or a money quote you want to leave with?
Yeah, I think, if we're going to have I think one or two takeaways, I think first is the weight of evidence is that supply chains are more or less back to normal. However, a big part of that's due to weak demand. And it won't be until we've gotten through the peak season that we actually know that we're actually back to normal. I think the second point is that these long-term corporate strategy shifts that have been anticipated in the wake of disruptions aren't yet clear. And it could be another 6 months at least before they become clear because of all of the shifting data that we would need to track. Hopefully by the next time we talk about our supply chain outlook, we'll have more evidence on all of those points.
All right. So mostly back to normal and still waiting for clarity on corporate strategies.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris, for sharing your insights with us again. We look forward to having you back soon for our series on nearshoring to Mexico. And thank you for tuning in. I'll drop a link to the Supply Chain Essentials newsletter in case you want to sign up, and let us know what you thought of this episode and what you'd like to hear on the podcast going forward.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.